What happens when family lines cross too closely? When cousins marry cousins, not once, but for generations? When siblings grow up isolated and end up as partners? When a child is born from a mother who was once her father's daughter? These stories don't come from medieval Europe or distant villages. They come from inside America. Right now, in parts of West Virginia, Texas, the Dakotas, and even major cities, there are women living with the lifelong consequences of inbreeding, not by choice, but by birth. Some were born with faces that genetics couldn't hide. Others never learned to speak. A few were never even given real names. This video tells their stories. We're not talking about myths or urban legends. These are documented cases, some hidden by families, others uncovered by medical tests or social workers. In each case, the women were born into a bloodline too close for nature to correct. You've probably heard of royal incest, or seen fictional depictions in crime dramas. But what if I told you there are American women, alive or recently deceased, whose entire lives were shaped by incest, between siblings, cousins, even parent and child? This is not about judgment, it's about reality. Over the next few minutes, you'll hear 5 stories. One woman born in a mountain town so isolated, her entire family spoke only in grunts. Another, the product of a father-daughter relationship, never walked on her own. Some were raised in silence. Others were buried in it. These are America's most inbred women, and their stories have remained hidden. Until now. Gracie Irene Whitaker was born around 1920 in Odd, West Virginia, a name that fits its story too well. Her parents were first cousins, and their parents were twin brothers. That meant Gracie came into the world already carrying a double dose of shared DNA. But her story didn't stop there. She later married her own double cousin, John Emery Whitaker, someone who was genetically almost as close as a sibling. In a remote Appalachian community where isolation was normal and outsiders were rare, marriages like theirs weren't unusual. They were expected. Together, Gracie and John had 15 children. Most of them never learned to speak. Many couldn't read or write. Several had visible physical deformities, misaligned eyes, distorted facial features, and uncoordinated motor functions. At least one could only communicate in grunts. Locals whispered about the family, calling them off or touched, but no one intervened. This was backwoods West Virginia in the early 20th century, poor, forgotten, and closed off. Medical records were scarce. No one diagnosed the genetic issues. But as the children grew, the pattern became undeniable. Generations of consanguinity had compounded, and Gracie's children carried the cost in their bodies and minds. Despite the obvious challenges, Gracie never left Odd. She lived and died in the same house, surrounded by the family she created, many of whom could barely function independently. She never spoke to the press. No outsider truly knew her mind. But through the people she brought into the world, Gracie became the living center of one of the most extreme cases of familial inbreeding ever documented in the U.S. To this day, some of her descendants still live on the same land. And while many Americans don't know her name, Gracie Whitaker's legacy survives in the faces, voices, and silence of those she left behind. Lorine wasn't just born into the Whitaker family. She was born deep into its genetic spiral. She was the daughter of Gracie and John Emery Whitaker, themselves double cousins. That meant the same DNA was circulating again and again, compressing over generations. She entered the world in the 1940s in the same rural home her mother had been born in. But something was different. From a young age, Lorine struggled. She didn't speak. She couldn't focus. Her eyes didn't track movement the way other children's did. Her muscles were weak, her movements uncoordinated. She never learned to read, never attended proper school, and rarely left the family's isolated property. Neighbors, those few who lived close enough to know, referred to her as slow or simple. But the truth was deeper. Lorine wasn't just developmentally delayed. She was likely severely intellectually disabled, a result of repeated consanguinity. Tests done decades later on living relatives confirmed what doctors suspected. The Whitaker bloodline had reached a genetic tipping point. Lorine's life stayed confined to the family property. She never married, never worked, never lived independently. Most of her interactions were limited to family members who shared the same conditions. Her world was a closed loop. No formal diagnosis was ever made. No government agency stepped in. In the Appalachian backwoods of the mid-20th century, families like the Whitakers existed on the fringe, out of sight, out of mind. By the time Lorine died, likely in her 40s or 50s, there was no obituary, no public record, just silence. Another life shaped and limited by a bloodline that kept circling itself. Her story, like so many others from her family, might have vanished entirely. But in the fragments that remain, we see the real cost of what happens when the same genes meet over and over again. Rita was born in Texas around 2010, but her story doesn't begin in a hospital. It begins in a hidden room, in a house no one wanted to look too closely at. Her mother was just a teenager, and also the biological daughter of the man who fathered Rita. It wasn't discovered right away. The baby girl was small, born early, and had trouble breathing. Doctors saw some red flags. Her facial structure seemed off, her heartbeat irregular. But it was only after a full genetic test, triggered by unexplained bruises, that the truth came out. Her mother and father were also daughter and father. The test revealed massive regions of identical DNA, the kind only seen in cases of first-degree incest. This wasn't cousin marriage. This was biological duplication on a level that triggers the worst outcomes: congenital defects, neurological damage, and lifelong dependency. As Rita grew, the signs became undeniable. She didn't speak, not just delayed, but nonverbal. She had difficulty walking and required constant physical therapy. She was diagnosed with a rare heart defect, had surgery for a cleft lip, and later developed hydrocephalus, fluid buildup in the brain. A shunt was inserted to relieve the pressure. By the age of 4, both of her biological parents were in prison. Her mother had tried to justify the relationship as love, but the law and the state saw it for what it was: child abuse passed down another generation. Rita became a ward of the state, placed in a long-term care facility in Houston. Now a teenager, she still doesn't speak. She has limited motor control and severe cognitive delays. Her future is uncertain. She requires full-time care and likely always will. Rita is a living example of what happens when incest isn't just abuse, it becomes biology. Her story isn't folklore. It's not a cautionary tale from the past. It's real, it's recent, and it's still unfolding inside a locked care facility most Texans have never heard of. Maria was born in the mid-1970s in a Hutterite colony in South Dakota, a closed, deeply religious community that valued tradition, simplicity, and endogamy. Her parents were second cousins, part of a long line of intermarriage within the group. It wasn't scandal, it was cultural continuity. At birth, Maria showed signs of a rare condition: a recessed chin, misshapen ears, and a cleft palate. Doctors would later diagnose her with Treacher-Collins syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects the development of facial bones and tissue. While not exclusive to inbreeding, the chances of its surfacing were heightened in genetically isolated populations. Unlike many others born into close genetic loops, Maria's mind was unaffected. Her hearing was impaired, but her intelligence remained intact. She learned to read, sign, and function within the small school system of her colony. The Hutterites didn't ostracize her. Their faith emphasized care for the weak, and Maria became known not for her condition, but for her persistence. She wore a hearing aid, underwent surgeries to correct some of her features, and eventually became a caregiver for younger children within the colony. Her case was studied in a medical journal. not because it was the worst outcome, but because it represented the hidden risks of even distant inbreeding when amplified over generations. Now in her 50s, Maria still lives in that same colony. She married a distant cousin outside the at-risk gene pool and has 2 healthy children. She's considered a survivor, not a victim. Maria's story is different. It shows that not every case of consanguinity ends in tragedy, but everyone carries risk. Her face bears the imprint of her ancestry. But her life proves that with support and access to care, even genetics don't write the full story. Linda was born in Houston in 2011 to a married couple who were first cousins. They were recent immigrants from the Middle East, where cousin marriage is culturally accepted and even encouraged in some communities. In their world, it wasn't taboo, it was tradition. But the genetics didn't care about culture. From birth, Linda struggled. She was born slightly premature, with muscle weakness, feeding difficulties, and subtle physical differences. At first, doctors couldn't pinpoint the cause. But as developmental delays became more obvious, genetic testing was ordered. The results confirmed it. Linda's parents shared a significant amount of identical DNA, consistent with first-degree cousin pairing. That meant their daughter had a much higher risk of inheriting 2 copies of harmful genes. And that's exactly what happened. As she grew, Linda faced multiple health issues. She was diagnosed with a missing kidney, experienced frequent seizures, and had trouble speaking. Her head circumference remained unusually small, microcephaly, and her learning capacity lagged far behind her peers. By age 6, she was placed in a specialized classroom for children with intellectual disabilities. Her parents remained committed, but overwhelmed. They told doctors they had never been warned about the genetic risks. They saw her condition as God's will. Culturally, they didn't see their marriage as unusual. Today, Linda is 14. She attends school part-time, with therapy sessions nearly every week. She can speak simple sentences but still struggles to read and write. Her IQ hovers around 70, functionally limited but not nonverbal. She lives at home, heavily reliant on her parents for support. Linda's case is not rare. As genetic testing becomes more accessible, more cases like hers are being documented across America, in communities where tradition collides with science. Her story isn't about blame. It's about what happens when culture and biology drift in different directions, and a child is caught in the middle.